Hello and welcome to the Khmer Times Crosstalk. I'm Mon Bantay. Today's guest is Mr. Scheuer, who for the past 3 years has been the United Nations Resident Coordinator in Cambodia. And Joe has completed his posting in Cambodia and now he is with us in our Khmer Times studio. Mr. Joe will reflect on leadership, coordination challenges, lessons learned, and the path forward for Cambodia and the United Nations continue engagement in the country. Mr. Joe, thank you for coming on the show. Could you please introduce yourself and tell our audience what your responsibilities have been in Cambodia, please?
Good morning, and thank you first of all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So my responsibilities as resident coordinator currently include simply the coordination of the work of the United Nations country team in Cambodia, which is constituted of 36 different UN entities, 36, that have activities in the country. Some having very large programs in sectors of education, agriculture, health, and others have very small, sort of more niche interventions. But you can picture that the United Nations country team is engaged on pretty much every development issue that Cambodia itself is working on. And from a personal perspective, I'm from Luxembourg, but also perhaps what is interesting for your viewers is this is my second time working with the United Nations in Cambodia. I was based here also from 2007-2010 as UNDP country director.
Thank you for your introduction. Sure. So, you started your role in Cambodia in a particularly significant time, just as the country, Cambodia, was hosting the ASEAN Summit in 2022. How did that moment shape your early engagement with the national leadership and your priorities as UN Resident Coordinator?
Good question. Indeed, I arrived in late October 2022, so I think it was exactly 3 weeks before the ASEAN Summit. Which, congratulations again to the Cambodian government, went off very, very well. So it was a little bit of a baptism by fire, as they say, arriving in a country and 3 weeks later you have such a high-level event, which for us also included the visit of the United Nations Secretary General, which is always a big responsibility for the team locally. And that actually helped in the sense that with the visit of the Secretary General, very early on I met all the senior leaders of the government, because I accompanied him to his engagements. And that reintroduced me very quickly again to the leadership of the country, whom I had known to some extent already, of course, from my previous assignment here. Now, having said that, the ASEAN Summit itself didn't really shape the work of the UN at that time. I think what was more than shaping the work we were planning our work are perhaps 2 or 3 other things. One is that we're coming just out of the COVID pandemic. And so what did we learn from that in terms of the resilience? What did we establish as partners with the government in terms of social protection? How do we take that forward? So I think that was one very important component. Feeding into 2023, which was the year where we designed our current cooperation framework. A second issue that had emerged at that time already throughout 2022 is the impact of transnational crime within the region, including Cambodia. And that became a dominant issue in the work I've done over the last 3 years. And then thirdly, perhaps what we are looking at and also learning from some of the countries in the ASEAN community is how to prepare for LDC graduation. So Cambodia will graduate from the LDC, the least developed country status, in 2029, and we started working on that already in 2023. But the ASEAN Summit itself wasn't so much of dominance to our work that we at the national level do with the government of Cambodia.
Thank you. And what has been the most difficult challenges for the United Nations in working in Cambodia? And how should that experience help recalibrate UN support going forward?
Actually, development is inherently challenging, right, in terms of achieving the objectives of any country. And of course, the role of the United Nations in a country is to support that country in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. 17 have been globally adopted in 2015. Cambodia has added an 18th in terms of a land-free Cambodia. And advancing this SDG agenda itself is a big challenge because you need to align policy support and technical advice. You need to align capacity and financing. You need to overcome political or money interests. So it's in every country, in that sense, quite difficult. And let's be honest, globally, as a world community, we are not doing well on achieving the SDGs, which are supposed to be set by 2030. But that's the job. That's what we're here for. And so I actually, looking back over the last 3 years, don't find that it was particularly challenging. We have a really excellent partnership with government and other development partners. We have great access to senior leaders when we need to. I had the fortune to have a very large country team, as I mentioned, 36 entities active, but also a very collegial and constructive country team. So I think if I had something to wish for, is that our member states would design the United Nations. We have a reform process going on called UN80 to be even more effective as we come together and to be clearer on how we can do the financing of these development objectives together.
During your time here, how has the United Nations adjusted its development and policy support to remain responsive to Cambodia's evolving needs, while at the same time maintaining long-term development gains?
I think there's two issues that stand out, building also on what I just mentioned in terms of sort of the broader context. First of all, as a country like Cambodia does better year by year in terms of economic development, socioeconomic development, it will graduate from LDC status. The role naturally will change from a UN 20, 30 years ago that was very much in the trenches delivering services and being hands-on, to a UN that's much more upstream in terms of regulatory and legal frameworks, in terms of policy support, in terms of helping the country attract financing, in terms of its convening role. So you have less projects and more upstream work. Within that also what we see, because the whole world of course is moving forward as well, is a request for the UN to be more forward-looking. And so what we're integrating more in our work right now, step by step, is issues of foresight, of behavioral change, of being more data-driven, more innovative, and also really integrate the digital world and now, of course, AI into the way we engage with our partners. I think that's probably the biggest shift that is happening. Having said that, I should also point that, of course, 2025 has sent massive shockwaves through the international development community, including, of course, the UN system, in terms of the way it is being funded. A majority of the big, member states that have been funding international development as well as humanitarian aid have cut back massively. And I think that realignment is still playing itself out, and the shift that has to happen is a shift away from funding development through other member states, although some of that will be maintained, to financing development in assisting a government such as Cambodia in attracting private sector investment, national and international, help de-risk those investments and so forth, and actually channel them in a way that they contribute to the achievement of the development goals of the country. So those would be the two changes I would point out.
Global UN principles such as human rights, gender equality, and leaving no one behind can sometimes seem abstract. How have you worked to translate these values into practical country-level action in the Cambodian context?
Interesting that you say they can be abstract. For me, they are not so well, leave no one behind is perhaps, what we call the LNOB agenda, can be a bit initially confusing. But, let's talk about human rights. Let's talk about gender. It's universal human rights. So first of all, I think it's very clear that human rights apply to every human being on the planet, regardless where they are, who they are, where they come from, etc. And as a world community, we're all in different stages in achieving that, absolute goal of having rights secured for everyone. So as such, it is a key priority for us in everything we do to talk about human rights, but talk about all human rights, not just those where we don't make progress, but also those where we do. So social, economic rights, cultural rights, civic rights, political rights, etc. So that's very important. Development itself is rights-based. Take the example to make it more concrete. A child has the right to education. The government has the obligation to provide education. Parents have the obligation to send the child to school. Teachers have the obligation to provide a good quality class. And so you differentiate between the rights holder, the child is the rights holder in this case, and the duty bearer, the teacher, the parent, the government, to provide that education. And so across the work we do, there is always underneath a rights issue. There's nothing that's not somehow related to rights. The way we talk about it, of course, is constructively. Our job is to keep supporting the government and other partners in moving this agenda forward step by step everywhere. And I think this is what's very noteworthy is that at the Universal Periodic Review, which is the mechanism where member states provide advice to other member states on how they are doing. So Cambodia was being reviewed for the fourth time just a couple of months ago, the Human Rights Council in Geneva. Other countries made 270 recommendations to Cambodia. Cambodia accepted over 230. So over 80% of the recommendations that member states, the peers of Cambodia, have made to Cambodia, Cambodia has accepted. So plenty of work to be done to move that forward. So this is a way I would just slightly unpack perhaps the human rights agenda. Gender, of course, gender is super important. Now, we get sometimes confused about the word gender. It's, of course, broader than just women and girls. Of course, at the end of the day, a lot of that work within that is about women and girls. Very simply put, you cannot develop a country if you keep half of your population not engaged in the development of the country, if you somehow hold them back, be that to education access, be that to other issues that do not allow women and girls to fully participate in society. So gender equality is an absolutely necessary key driver to unleash that capacity and make the country move forward. Another example within the gender-based violence, there can be no room in any country for gender-based violence or domestic violence. So these are things we work on very practically all the time. We just concluded a 16-day campaign, for instance, on December 10th, which is an annual campaign where we're working with government to advocate for the eradication of gender-based violence. To come back to the initial question, and I know this is a very long answer, but allow me, because you talk about human rights, gender, leave no one behind, these are big issues. When it comes to leave no one behind, this is the essence of the mandate of the United Nations. I mentioned earlier that our job in the country, very simply put, is to help the country achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, which 193 countries, including Cambodia, said they would do. So we're not imposing anything. Cambodia said they want to achieve the SDGs. We are here to help. Within that is that concept of leaving no one behind, which simply means that everyone in the country needs to be benefiting from the development of that country. A very concrete example is that we then zero in on those most vulnerable communities that might not be reached by a particular intervention, policy, service, or whatever. An example is about 92%, I think, of children born in Cambodia right now have a birth certificate issued to them. In today's modern society, a birth certificate is essential, for example, to benefit from being able to school later on. But we have somewhere between, 7-8% of children in Cambodia that do not get a birth certificate. Now, the government has passed a very, very good civil registration and vital statistics law that simply says every life event in the country needs to be recorded. Every birth needs to be recorded. Now, the population where we see the gap are minorities. They include the Khmer, they include the Vietnamese community, they include indigenous people, they include Shia Muslims, they include people that are simply very poor, perhaps in remote areas. So we need to do a very concerted effort to help the government implement that law, which I said is really brilliant, to make sure that as soon as possible, every child born in Cambodia gets a birth certificate. So this is how you can break it down, but it's at the core really of what we as the United Nations are doing.
Earlier on, you mentioned about LDC graduation. So Cambodia is moving toward graduation from least developed country status while also working to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. In your view, what opportunities does this transition create and what risks must be carefully managed?
So first, of course, I think it's a milestone worth celebrating, LDC graduation. Sometimes we're talking about that moment as something that the country, in this case Cambodia, will lose. No, it's actually a recognition of the world community that the country has done really, really well. Now, it comes with certain changes in the way Cambodia will be integrated further into the global community and how development partners engage. There will be trade preferences that will disappear, which is, of course, a big issue for Cambodia because it's a very export-centric economy. And there will be different implications on the way financing can be accessed. For example, cheap loans that a least developed country can access. What we are advocating for the government of Cambodia, because in many ways they're already quite well prepared, looking ahead at 29 when graduation actually is happening, is not to just look at this 5-year period. We are now concluding the first year of the 5-year period as an issue of access to finance and trade. Cambodia has set itself a very ambitious target to be a high-income country by 2050. And based on my discussions with government and our partners, I'm very certain that the authorities know what it takes to get there. If we only look at the next 5 years in terms of trade and access to financing, we miss an opportunity to further solidify and expand the foundation required to get to a high income status by 2050. And allow me to give 2 examples. One is, let's use this time to also make sure the economy is more diverse, that it meets the standards for future exports into current markets. For example, if we want to continue exporting into EU, we'll have to meet ever more specific targets on labor rights, on environmental standards, on the carbon footprint, on deforestation-free value chains. And so helping the government to get, with the private sector, up to speed on all these issues so that it can continue to be competitive in future markets when it loses trade preferences. And the second example is that climate change is here with all of us. It's a reality. Some people like to deny it. That's too bad on them. It's a reality. Cambodia will be impacted. For example, in terms of heat stress in garment factories as well, something we are working on. So what can we do now to ensure that by 2050, the negative impacts of climate change will not reduce Cambodia's development progress? There is a real scenario that this could happen, but if we work on this now, we can lay the foundation for 2050. And this, for example, is why it was so important this year to work on Cambodia's National Climate Plan, the NDC, which the government presented at the last COP in Brazil just a few weeks ago. What we did this year with the government to develop the NDC, and the UN helped convene all development partners in support of the government. So what the government decided to put in the NDC this year decides what the government will do the next 5 years with its partners. An NDC period is 5 years. And it will lay the foundation to 2050. So it's very important to look at the short-term impacts, but also look very strategically at 2050 on those issues.
So development today increasingly depends on partnership across government, civil society, youth, and the private sector. Which types of partnership have proven most impactful, and why are they essential for today's development challenges?
I would, from a UN perspective, I would respond to that maybe in 3 parts. As the United Nations, our job is to serve our member states. So as the head of the UN here, together with my colleagues on the country team, our first priority is to support government in the implementation of its development priorities. And I mentioned earlier the cooperation framework, so we decide every 5 years where we intervene and where we support the government. And that will always remain, by design of United Nations, our most important partnership. Having said that, that by itself will not develop any country. And if you look at successful countries, these are countries where human rights are being realized, where civil society is vibrant and can contribute, where government or the private sector or development partners cannot. It will also help us keep everyone honest in terms of the work that we're doing moving forward on issues like leave no one behind, or any kind of particular issue you want to mention. And so working with civil society is core to any sort of progress and development you want to see to get to a high income status. And then already alluded to it earlier, I think the third part I want to mention to this is the private sector. Traditionally, development comes from a place where we did not work with the private sector. But let's be real. The investments come from majority private sector investments. It's the private sector that will drive the investments and development. A government can regulate, can incentivize, can provide seed funding, provides policy direction. Development partners can provide similarly seed funding and support, but at the end of the day, it depends what the private sector does. And we need to integrate them much, much better in the work we are moving forward. And as I said, moving from funding development to financing development to working very closely with the private sector as well.
Right, and can you tell us a defining part of your time here that you are most proud of?
There's too many. What should I say? Well, first of all, I'm really honored that I've had the opportunity to come back a second time, and this time serve post-COVID pandemic at a time where Cambodia was re-emerging from that difficult period, at a time where we saw generational leadership change after the 23 elections, which is a momentous, how do you say, it's a very important moment in Cambodia's history, and being able to lead the UN during that time, these 2 years, has been a privilege and an honor. So let me first of all say that, and I'm deeply grateful for that. In terms of the work we've done, it will be really difficult to mention one specific issue because there's so much engagement that's happening through the spectrum of the UN country team, and in each of these sectors we've seen progress being made and big milestones being achieved. And I want to be very specific. They are not the UN's achievements. They are Cambodia's achievements. We might contribute to them, sometimes more, sometimes less, but they're obviously Cambodia's achievements. Perhaps one example I can mention, because you asked me earlier about how also the UN is changing and how we want to be more impactful. We're understanding better the convening role of the United Nations at country level and the importance of the blue flag to bring partners together. And one thing I've personally done, perhaps, which gives me a lot of satisfaction, is that I had the privilege to work with the governor of the central bank on convening stakeholders in the microfinance and financial industry to look at the indebtedness level in Cambodia, look at consumer protection, look at the practices on how also the poor society in Cambodia is accessing financing through formal or informal mechanism, and make all of that system work better. And over the last 2 years, to very financially cheap, if you wish, investments, but convening stakeholders and providing a platform for dialogue, we've been able to agree across all the different groups, from the financial industry to the government, to the regulators, to the development partners, to the civil society and NGOs, to investors, on 22 sets of recommendations, which all have been already half achieved or under implementation, and will make the whole financial industry in that sense work much better for Cambodians. A very low-key investment based on the ability to convene stakeholders and provide a platform for dialogue. So I think that's a key achievement that illustrates how we can do more, sometimes also with less, in terms of the financial requirement.
Recent border tensions have affected communities and livelihoods. Almost 1 million migrant workers have returned from working in Thailand, and more than 500,000 have been displaced. From the UN's perspective, what action have you taken?
Big question. So let me first of all, on behalf of the country team here in Cambodia, express my sincere condolences to all the victims and casualties of the ongoing hostilities. We are hoping, of course, that yesterday we would see finally a ceasefire being declared. We're not there yet. And in terms of what is the UN doing, let me point to the fact that politically, of course, the UN system, the UN machinery is engaged at the highest level to the United Nations Secretary General, who is engaging with both countries at New York level and otherwise, as well as the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And I think you might have seen the statements also they have issued publicly. Of course, there's much more happening behind closed doors. So that's the way the UN system operates in support of its member states globally. For us here in Cambodia, what are we doing? First of all, we're extending the support we can to the IDPs, the internally displaced people, in support of the government's efforts. We are helping as the UN coordinate development partner and NGO support to those affected populations that have been displaced. We are working with the colleagues from NCDM, the government, on an assessment in terms of needs, and do whatever we can in a time where humanitarian funding also has been slashed by the international community to make sure that these displaced populations have what they need. At the same time, of course, hoping that they can be returning to their communities as soon as possible, in which time there's going to be a recovery strategy to support them as they rebuild their lives in their border communities. We had done that already after the hostilities earlier this summer, and of course then the whole issue flared up again. I think a more critical issue, however, that will stay with Cambodia for a while is the up to 1 million. I think our count is about 900,000 migrants that returned from Thailand. They've worked there. This is in some ways perhaps the most significant development shock Cambodia has seen in the last 30 years, COVID pandemic aside. These 900,000 on average supported 3 or 4 other Cambodians with the money they earned. Conservative estimate is that about 4 million Cambodians, so we're closing into one quarter of the population, has currently less income. We need to integrate them in the job market. We need to help them access services. We need those that need ID poor cards get ID poor cards. We need to work with children to go back in school. A large number of these individuals or families had been in Thailand for 6, 7, 10 or more years. So integration is very difficult. It will take time. And so our efforts have to really, really focus on what are we going to do collectively as UN, development partners, civil society and government to make sure that they can be integrated as fast as possible, job market and otherwise. And of course, in the medium term, become a driving force for Cambodia's economic growth and future development. But the challenge right now is immense. And we need to really look at how we finance this. A good scenario is here that the government has a certain amount of fiscal space. We'll have to see how that can be carefully used. But just as the government had prioritized the social well-being of its population during the COVID pandemic, I think it's absolutely paramount that we do the same now all collectively for these returnees as well.
However, many Cambodian people have questions, especially on social media. The question is that because they have a feeling of inaction on the United Nations behalf, so many Cambodians are now questioning the purpose of the UN. So how do you respond to that?
I'm first of all very aware of that criticism, and we see this, of course, in similar scenarios in other contexts as well, in other countries as well. There is no easy answer, unfortunately, at the moment that we are. The simplest thing I can say is to invite everyone to try and understand better what is the instrument, the United Nations. Who is actually in charge of the United Nations? How can and must it operate in such a scenario? We cannot do anything without government approval or member states' approval, because we're a tool the member states gave themselves to achieve certain objectives. In this particular case, we have 2 countries that have border tensions, one of which Cambodia is advocating very strongly for international support in solving the issue, and another one is saying, no, this is a bilateral issue. We can't impose as United Nations our will on either country. We serve at the will of these countries. So that's one issue that's often misunderstood, because people think, well, why is the UN not just going out and doing things? We don't have that authority, right? So that's a very important point. The second point is we need to maintain neutrality. We have to realize that what I do here, I have a peer in Thailand who's doing the same thing. Let's take a very simple issue. Thailand alleges that Cambodia laid new landmines. Cambodia says, no, we did not lay new landmines. And the issue is now under review under the formal UN Ottawa Convention process. Imagine I say Cambodia is right. The UN loses credibility in Thailand. Imagine Thailand, my peer says, Thailand is right. We lose credibility in Cambodia, and we would undermine the transparent, independent verification process that has to happen to actually establish under the convention process. Are there new landmines or are there not new landmines? None of this is easy to understand for regular citizens that just want peace and that want help and that see that not responded to. And I understand that frustration, I sympathize with it, but it is not inaction. It is the way we are designed and being used. And most of our work, therefore, whenever it comes to sensitive issues, are behind closed doors. To circle this back to your question earlier on human rights, you don't see us standing on the street corner screaming human rights abuse or this is a problem or that is a problem. That's not our job. Our job is work with the government and other partners to advance the human rights agenda. And I'm very grateful that behind closed doors we can say everything that needs to be said, but continue to work constructively together. So I would conclude by just saying to Cambodians that are frustrated with the UN, be assured that we are all over this to the maximum of our abilities. It might not seem enough at the moment when there's still fighting going on and civilians are being hurt, but we do everything we can.
After 3 years with the United Nations in Cambodia, what has surprised you the most about the country?
That's a really good question. I mentioned earlier in the introduction that I was based here 2007, 2010, and then I came back in 2022. And it's no surprise when I say that when I came back in 22, many of the leaders I met I had known from before. So some of them would say, "Oh, Joe, it's great to have you back. It's so wonderful that you come a second time. And tell me, what has changed? What do you see?" So I've been thinking about this question a lot. And of course, the initial sort of immediate response is, well, economic development, you see all these buildings, et cetera, et cetera. Cambodia is doing much better in that front. But actually, the fundamental change is a different one. When I arrived in 2007, in that time into the UNDP office, we didn't have a single young professional Cambodian in our team. Because if you look at Cambodia's history, that generation hadn't come through yet to the education system, having a master's degree and being able to successfully apply for an entry-level professional job in the UN. There was a gap because of the war, the Khmer Rouge period and everything that ensued. And I remember that in late 2008, I hired the first Cambodian colleague, a woman who is now in the national staff of the UN in New York. She's the first one I hired, had just come out of university, and the first professional post-UNTAC period, so post-early 90s, that we brought into the UN team. But that generation between 2025 to 4045 was absent in the work we did. When I came back 3 years ago, that generation is everywhere. Everywhere. In private sector, in civil society, in government, in development partners. And that makes you extremely hopeful for the future in terms of what Cambodia can achieve. A caveat, we have achieved this success, or this change so far, with only about a third of Cambodians graduating high school. So on the positive, if the education sector can catch up and more Cambodians, of course, get the required education, that positive driver towards the high income target for 2050 will be accelerated. But we must get education right. So everything has a challenge and opportunity, right? But to me, that's the most important change that is overlooked, because also outside observers forget the very complicated history that Cambodia has come through. And change like this is generational. It is not something that happens over a couple of years. It's really many, many years that it takes to get to that point. But that really, that youth dividend, if you wish, is, I think, what is most important.
As you are prepared to leave Cambodia, what message would you like to share with the Cambodian people and with the UN teams who will continue this work in the years ahead?
Well, my message to the as a resident coordinator to the UN team is very easy. They will not be surprised. So I should actually look at the UN team right now. It's very simple. Please work together. Always focus on the impact you can make on Cambodian society. Work together as one. They will not be surprised. They will be laughing now. Some of them might roll their eyes, but in a positive way. In terms of Cambodians themselves, perhaps a message for youth. Because what we are doing, of course, to development is continue building a future for them. We need certainly to involve them more. I think we are all guilty in senior positions that we're not listening to youth enough. Having said that, my wish for youth is to realize that, and this might sound counterintuitive, if you look at global problems, you look at the border tensions, but it's a fact that there has never been a better time for humanity to be alive than today. Globally, we're doing better than ever. There are some problems with our business model, think climate change, so we need to be more sustainable. But my message to youth would be, stay engaged, be curious, in a constructive way, question authority and leadership to hold them accountable and honest. Know your rights, but also know your obligations as a citizen, and invest in your country. And I think if you find a way where you have a passion and the quality of the sort of companies of work you do, you can be a super positive force for the country, as well as build a wonderful life for yourself.